The C-130 transport plane roared low over the jagged peaks of eastern Alaska, its vibrations rattling Dr. Elena Vargas's teeth. She clutched her duffel bag tightly, staring out of the frosted window at the endless expanse of snow and ice. For weeks, her handler had been vague about the details of the assignment, insisting only that it was urgent and required her expertise. The usual government cloak and dagger nonsense. But Elena knew one thing for sure. Whatever she was about to uncover, it wasn't in any geology textbook. The aircraft banked sharply, revealing a scattering of buildings huddled against a glacier. A single plume of smoke curled from one of the outpost's chimneys, the only sign of life. As the plane touched down on the icy runway, a sense of foreboding settled over her. The cold hit like a slap as the door opened, and a grim-faced soldier motioned her out. "Welcome to Station Perseus," he said. "I hope you brought warm clothes." Inside, the station was a maze of narrow corridors, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Elena's boots clanged against the metal grating as she followed the soldier to the central briefing room. A handful of people were already seated around a large table, their faces pale and drawn. A woman in a lab coat introduced herself as Dr. Yvonne Danner, the station's lead researcher. Her voice was clipped as though every word was a concession to formality. "You've been brought here because of this," Danner said, gesturing to a screen that displayed a jagged waveform. "A signal we intercepted 3 weeks ago. At first, we thought it was background noise, some kind of geological anomaly. But the pattern is too deliberate." Elena leaned in, frowning. The waveform shifted, a strange melodic hum crackling through the speakers. It sounded almost alive. "What's causing it?" she asked. "We don't know," Danner admitted, "but the source is directly beneath us, deep in the glacier." The room fell silent. Elena's mind raced. A signal originating from under miles of ice? It defied logic. And yet, the hairs on her arms stood on end as she stared at the screen. Something about it felt wrong, as though it wasn't meant to be heard. That night, Elena lay awake in her bunk, listening to the groans of the ice outside. The others avoided her, their conversations hushed and jittery. A faint hum, barely audible, seemed to resonate through the station. She dismissed it as a trick of her mind, but when she finally drifted off, her dreams were restless, fragments of twisting shadows and something massive stirring beneath her feet. The next day, she joined a team in the communications lab to analyze the signal further. As they worked, strange things began to happen. Equipment malfunctioned without warning. Computer screens flickered with static, displaying unreadable symbols. One technician swore he saw movement in the darkened corridor beyond the lab, but when they checked, it was empty. Then the first death occurred. A systems technician was found in the storage room, his body contorted unnaturally, eyes frozen wide in terror. His chest cavity had collapsed inward, as though something had sucked the life out of him. Danner tried to brush it off as an accident, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Elena pushed harder for answers, and Danner reluctantly revealed the truth. The station wasn't built here by coincidence. It had been monitoring anomalies in the area for decades, and this signal was the first solid evidence of something extraordinary and potentially dangerous. Determined to uncover the truth, Elena proposed a direct expedition into the glacier to locate the source of the signal. Dana resisted at first, but when another researcher reported hearing the hum emanating from beneath the ice, her resolve broke. They suited up in thermal gear, armed with state-of-the-art scanners and tools, and descended into the cavern. The tunnel was a narrow, jagged path carved by decades of ice movement. Their breaths formed clouds that froze on their faces as they ventured deeper. The hum grew louder, vibrating through their bodies like a heartbeat. Finally, they reached a chamber unlike anything Elena had ever seen. It was warm, unnaturally so, and the walls were lined with veins of luminous blue material that pulsed faintly. In the center of the chamber lay the cocoon, an organic structure the size of a small car, its surface shimmering and wet. As they approached, the cocoon began to pulse, its rhythm matching the hum of the signal. Elena felt a deep, instinctual fear rising in her chest, but before she could call for the team to retreat, the cocoon split open with a wet, tearing sound. A high-pitched screech filled the chamber, and the team's lights flickered and died. In the sudden darkness, something moved. Something alive. The moment the cocoon ruptured, the air in the cavern changed. It thickened, becoming humid and foul, carrying an acrid metallic tang that clung to their throats. Elena's flashlight sputtered, its beam weak and unreliable. In the flickering light, something spilled from the cocoon, fluid, glistening, and viscous, pooling at their feet. Then came the first glimpse of the creature. It unfolded with a grotesque elegance, a tangle of translucent, membranous flesh and shifting appendages that seemed to ripple like liquid. Its body glowed faintly from within, bioluminescent veins pulsing in a sickly green hue. The thing was both formless and horrifyingly purposeful, every movement deliberate, like a predator testing its prey. It let out a shrill, resonant sound, an echo of the signal, and every member of the team doubled over, clutching their heads as the noise bored into their skulls. "Fall back!" someone shouted, but the words were barely audible over the creature's screech. One of the researchers panicked, stumbling into the pooling fluid. His scream cut through the chaos as the liquid hissed and bubbled, eating through his boots and into his flesh. Elena grabbed his arm, yanking him free, but the damage was done. The flesh on his lower leg peeled away in sheets, exposing raw, glistening muscle. The creature moved, its appendages unfurling like tendrils. They lashed out, impossibly fast, striking one of the soldiers in the chest. The impact sent him flying against the cavern wall, his body crumpling like a rag doll. Elena didn't stay to see if he was still breathing. She pulled the others toward the tunnel, adrenaline overriding the horror threatening to paralyze her. The trek back to the surface was a blur of shouts and disoriented movements, the creature's distant screeches echoing through the ice. When they finally breached the surface, gasping in the freezing air, the survivors collapsed in the snow. But relief was short-lived. The injured researcher writhed on the ground, his body convulsing unnaturally. Elena knelt beside him, watching in horror as black veins spread from the wound on his leg, his flesh contorting and twisting under some unseen force. "We need to amputate," she said urgently, but the others hesitated. Before they could act, the man's body arched violently, and a wet, ripping sound filled the air. His chest burst open, releasing a swarm of small, writhing creatures, miniature versions of what they had seen in the cavern. The swarm scattered into the surrounding snow and disappeared into the station before anyone could react. Panic erupted. The team retreated inside, sealing the doors and blocking every possible entry point. The outpost was eerily silent now, the distant hum of the signal replaced by a suffocating stillness. They gathered in the main lab, the tension palpable as everyone avoided looking at one another. Elena began analyzing samples of the creature's remains, her hands trembling as she worked. What she discovered was worse than she could have imagined. The creature's cells were unlike anything she'd ever studied, completely alien, capable of rapid replication and genetic manipulation. The sample had already begun integrating with the equipment, weaving threads of its own flesh into the lab's metal instruments. Worse, it appeared to respond to stimuli, almost as though it were sentient. "We're dealing with something more than a parasite," she said, her voice hoarse. "It's not just surviving, it's adapting." As the hours dragged on, paranoia infected the group. People began whispering about strange movements in the corridors, shadowy figures glimpsed out of the corner of their eyes. 2 crew members swore they saw one of the larval creatures scuttling into the air vents, but when they investigated, there was no sign of it. Meanwhile, the injured soldier began exhibiting symptoms: a fever, rapid heartbeat, and a strange, sinewy growth beneath his skin. The next transformation came swiftly and violently. The soldier, who had been restrained in the medbay, let out a guttural scream that echoed through the station. By the time Elena and the others arrived, it was too late. His body had split open along his spine, his arms and legs elongating into grotesque, chitinous limbs. His face, though partially human, was stretched into a permanent rictus of agony. The creature that was once a man lunged at the group, its movements jerky yet horrifyingly quick. It took 2 soldiers with flamethrowers to bring it down, the stench of burning flesh filling the medbay. But even as its charred remains collapsed, Elena noticed something horrifying. The flames had not fully killed it. Threads of sinew and tissue writhed on the floor, searching for a new host. Back in the lab, Elena pieced together a grim realization. The creature's biology wasn't just parasitic, it was predatory, consuming and rewriting its host's DNA to create something entirely new. Its hive-like behavior suggested a singular, horrifying goal: to replicate and expand. "We can't contain this," she admitted to Danner, her voice heavy with dread. "The more it spreads, the smarter it becomes. It's learning from us." As the survivors barricaded themselves in the station's central hub, a shared realization settled over them like a lead weight. The creature wasn't just killing them, it was becoming them. And somewhere beneath the ice, the original organism, the one that had hatched from the cocoon, was still alive. The storm outside was relentless, battering the station with howling winds and waves of snow so thick it blurred the horizon. Inside, the survivors gathered in the command room, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. The humming sound had returned, deeper and more insistent, vibrating through the walls and seeping into their bones. It was as if the signal were alive, a call meant to draw them closer to the source. Elena stood at the head of the table, her voice steady despite the rising panic around her. "We have no choice. If we don't destroy this thing at its source, it won't stop. The longer we wait, the more it spreads." The room fell into uneasy silence. Danner, pale and shaking, nodded reluctantly. "We'll take whatever weapons we have left. Flamethrowers, explosives. If it's down there, we'll make sure it doesn't come back." The plan was simple on paper. Descend into the glacier, locate the nest, and obliterate it. But everyone knew it was a suicide mission. The creature had already outsmarted them at every turn, and the thought of descending back into the labyrinth of ice, where the air itself seemed to breathe and shift, filled them all with dread. The remaining crew suited up in thermal gear, armed with everything they could carry. Flamethrowers strapped to their backs, high-powered flashlights in hand, they moved as a unit, descending once again into the frozen depths. The tunnel walls seemed narrower now, the air heavier. Frost clung to their visors, and the hum grew louder with each step. It didn't take long for the first signs of the creature to appear. Pulsating veins of bioluminescent material stretched along the ice, forming a web-like pattern that glowed faintly in the darkness. Pools of viscous liquid bubbled in unnatural formations, their surfaces rippling as if something beneath them were alive. One soldier poked at the edge of a pool with the tip of his rifle, and the liquid hissed, splattering his arm. He screamed as the fabric of his suit melted away, revealing charred flesh beneath. "Stay clear of the pools," Elena ordered, her voice sharp, "and watch your backs." They pressed on, deeper into the glacier's heart. The tunnels became more erratic, twisting and spiraling as though the ice itself had been warped by the creature's presence. Then they found the first body, a soldier from the earlier expedition, frozen upright in the ice. His face was partially fused into the wall, his expression locked in a silent scream. Black, spidery veins radiated out from his torso, spreading into the surrounding ice. "It's using them," Elena muttered, her stomach churning. "Turning them into something else." The team moved faster now, every creak and groan of the ice sending shivers down their spines. As they approached the central chamber, the air grew warmer, the bioluminescent veins brighter. The hum was no longer just a sound, it was a presence pressing against their thoughts, twisting their perceptions. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, and the walls seemed to ripple like liquid. Finally, they entered the nest. The chamber was massive, an open cavern of jagged ice and organic structures. The cocoon they had discovered earlier was only the beginning. Now, the chamber was filled with pulsating sacs, some the size of a human, others even larger. Each one glowed faintly, their surfaces stretched taut over the writhing shapes inside. Black tendrils snaked across the floor and walls, converging at the center where the creature waited. It was no longer the formless entity they had first encountered. Now it had grown into something immense, a towering amalgamation of flesh and sinew. Its body shimmered with the same bioluminescent veins, but it was no longer merely a predator. It was a living hive, its surface adorned with fragments of its victims, faces and limbs fused grotesquely into its mass. Their mouths moved soundlessly, their eyes wide and unseeing. The creature turned toward them, its form shifting and undulating. It emitted a low, guttural sound that vibrated through their bodies, freezing them in place. Then, with a horrifying grace, it moved. "Fire!" Elena shouted, breaking the paralysis. Flamethrowers roared to life, engulfing the chamber in waves of fire. The sacs burst one by one, releasing clouds of acrid smoke and shriveled, half-formed creatures that shrieked as they burned. The creature recoiled, its appendages thrashing wildly, but it did not retreat. Instead, it lashed out, impaling one soldier with a tendril that twisted through his body, lifting him into the air before ripping him apart. Explosions shook the chamber as they detonated their first charges, but the creature was relentless. It moved with an intelligence that was almost human, anticipating their attacks and using the terrain to its advantage. One by one, the team fell, their screams swallowed by the chaos. Elena and Dana were the last ones standing. They backed toward the cavern entrance, their flamethrowers running low. The creature loomed over them, its bioluminescent body casting eerie shadows across the ice. "Now!" Elena screamed, triggering the final charge. The explosion was deafening, a cascade of fire and ice collapsing the chamber in on itself. The creature let out a screech that rattled Elena's teeth, its form disappearing beneath the rubble. For a moment there was only silence, broken by the groaning of the collapsing glacier. Elena pulled Danner to her feet, both of them bleeding and barely able to stand. The tunnel behind them was collapsing, forcing them to run, every step a desperate fight for survival. When they finally emerged into the open air, the storm had cleared, revealing a dark, starless sky. They collapsed in the snow, too exhausted to speak. But as Elena stared back at the glacier, she felt no relief. The hum was gone, but the silence it left behind was even more unsettling. The silence in the aftermath was deafening. The glacier, once alive with unnatural sounds, had returned to its still, frozen quiet. Elena sat in the snow, staring at the jagged peaks on the horizon. Her breath was shallow, her limbs trembling. Danner lay beside her, clutching her side where a shard of ice had torn through her suit. The air was crisp and sharp, but it did little to clear the suffocating haze of dread that hung over them. "It's gone," Danner whispered, her voice barely audible. We did it." Elena wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that the nightmare was buried beneath the tons of ice now sealing the cavern. But deep down, she knew better. The glacier felt different. Too still, too expectant. The hum might have stopped, but the memory of it lingered, vibrating in her chest like an echo that refused to fade. The two women limped back to the station, their boots crunching through the snow. The facility was eerily empty, its corridors silent save for the occasional groan of the wind against the metal walls. The survivors, those who hadn't been claimed by the creature or turned into something unrecognizable, had all been lost in the chaos. Elena and Danner were alone now, the last witnesses to the horror beneath the ice. In the main lab, Elena began reviewing the data. She needed answers. The creature's biology, its patterns, its intent. Anything that might explain what they had faced. Her hands trembled as she typed, the cold biting through her gloves. Danner sat across from her, pale and distant, her gaze fixed on the far wall as if afraid to blink. Elena's findings only deepened her unease. The creature's cells, even in death, were still active. The samples they had collected were alive, replicating themselves at an exponential rate. Worse, they had begun to merge with the station's equipment, weaving filaments of organic material into the circuitry. The signal hadn't just been a call, it had been a seed, planted deep in the ice to grow and transform. Her heart sank as she pieced together the truth. The creature wasn't just an organism, it was an ecosystem designed to terraform its environment. The glacier was only the beginning. The spores released into the atmosphere during their encounter would spread, carried by the wind to every corner of the earth. It wasn't a question of if it would return, only when. She turned to Dana, her voice hollow. "We didn't stop it. We just slowed it down." Dana didn't respond. She was staring at her hand, her breath hitching. Black veins were spreading beneath her skin, pulsing faintly in time with her heartbeat. Elena froze, a lump of ice forming in her throat. "No," she whispered, crossing the room. "No, no, no." Dana's eyes met hers, wide with terror. "It's in me." Elena backed away, her mind racing. There was no way to stop it now. The infection was already inside the station, inside them. Dana's transformation would be the beginning, a foothold for the creature's return. The weight of it was crushing. Every step they had taken, every life they had lost, had only delayed the inevitable. Dana began to convulse, her body twisting unnaturally. Elena grabbed the nearest scalpel, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The struggle was brief, brutal, and heartbreaking. When it was over, Elena sat on the floor, her hands stained with blood and trembling uncontrollably. She couldn't feel the cold anymore. Her entire body was numb, her mind a fog of despair. But she wasn't done yet. She dragged herself to the control room, her legs barely supporting her weight. The station's self-destruct sequence was a last resort, a fail-safe designed to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophe. She activated it, her fingers moving on autopilot as alarms blared to life around her. "Warning! Station destruction sequence initiated. Evacuation recommended." Elena let out a bitter laugh. Evacuation. As if there was anywhere safe to go. She slumped into the nearest chair, staring at the countdown timer. 10 minutes. Just enough time to make sure the infection couldn't spread. Her thoughts drifted to the world beyond the glacier. Untouched cities, forests, and oceans. All of it would eventually succumb. The spores were already out there, invisible and unstoppable. She could only hope that her warning would be enough, that someone, somewhere, would find a way to fight back. She recorded her final message, her voice raw and weary. "This is Dr. Elena Vargas, Station Perseus. If you're hearing this, it's already begun. The organism beneath this glacier is unlike anything we've ever encountered. It's not just a threat, it's a force of nature designed to consume and transform. You have to find a way to stop it. Burn everything. Don't let it spread." As the timer ticked down, Elena stared out of the window at the auroras dancing across the sky. They were brighter than she'd ever seen, twisting and writhing like living things. The colors were wrong, too vivid, too sharp. For a moment she thought she could hear the hum again, faint but unmistakable, as if the auroras themselves were singing. The countdown reached 0. The explosion tore through the station, obliterating everything in its path. The glacier groaned as the ice collapsed, burying the remains of Station Perseus under a mountain of rubble. For a moment, the tundra was silent again, untouched and pristine. But high above, in the atmosphere, the auroras continued to dance, their patterns shifting in ways no human eye could comprehend. And far beyond the Earth, a new signal began to pulse, stronger, clearer, and more insistent than before.